Well, hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Bert Vanderkar. I am going to be attempting to moderate this discussion today. We are reading Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, and we have a group of people here in Boise, and we have a number of you online. Thank you all for being here. What I'm going to do initially, and also we have one person who hasn't joined us yet who has some organized presentation. I'm going to start today. And what I want to start out with, well, first of all, you have a feeling when you're reading Hegel, it's like, Toto, we're not in Kansas anymore. And it's a near universal experience. And over the years when I've tried to approach Hegel, I've been tripped up by just my inability to grasp some basic conceptual things. And I want to briefly go over some, and hopefully this won't seem abstract or dry, some basic concepts that when you get this, when you have your own grasp of this, a lot more things make sense. I want to talk about four basic concepts, how they relate, and one of the first things that's really good to be aware of, and although Hegel doesn't use the term specifically, I think it exists in a practical state in the text. It's of an immanent reading or an immanent critique. And in classic Hegelian fashion, it's easiest to tell you what an immanent critique or reading is by telling you what it's not. It's not, you don't approach a thought object or a situation and project all of your own opinions and knowledge or the structuring assumptions of another system on the situation. Necessarily, there's going to be some of that going on. But an immanent critique is more or less taking seriously the internal logic of the system you're focusing on. In a way, I try to think of it as when I go to see like a movie in a genre that is not terribly elevated, like an action film, I do an immanent critique. Does this film, within the context of the genre, do what it intends to do? Within the logic of its own terrain, does it succeed or fail? What kind of anomalies does it create or dispel? And Hegel all the time is, he opens the introduction by telling us that there's preconceptions about the nature of understanding, of consciousness, that we just take for granted. And that he wants us to, as much as we can, start afresh. So Hegel actually begins later in the section we're reading today with sense certainty. He begins with the world as we actually approach it. He doesn't begin with being. He doesn't begin with a statement like I am and show you how you can deduce everything from this initial statement. And that's really exciting. There's in a lot of ways there's a lot of practical import to an immanent critique. You can look at a concrete situation and maybe tease out things within its own logic that are valuable and things that you hate, so you don't have to completely approach a thought system and go, it's utterly bankrupt. Usually nothing's utterly bankrupt. And you can do this in an intelligent way that isn't just kind of cutting and pasting. And but anyway, the immanent critique is a real important thing. And when you're reading, especially secondary literature, it'll be mentioned a lot. But it really exists. It's really fundamental in a practical state in this text. Another thing is the concept of negativity. Negativity isn't just something that's bad. With negativity, and I had a problem with this for a long time. Let's just imagine that you've got this pure idea or something, or a pure object, and it's pretty much continuous. It's all itself. There's not much you can say about it. It's like it's one thing. The only way you can talk about it, the only way it can have any features, is through negativity, by something that's not that. And Hegel becomes rapturously poetic about the power of the negative. The power of the negative is what makes the understanding possible, that chops up the world into little pieces that you can at least talk about. And although the understanding itself may think that these pieces don't really communicate with each other, the reason which comes in later uses these as their fodder. So negativity is real important. Other ways of looking at it, it's a distinction. There's qualities, parts, aspects, but negativity is really at the heart of this. And all of these concepts flow into each other. What negativity does when you actually have something you can talk about, it creates determinatedness or determinateness. It determinations. And my own idiot idea of determination at one time was just causality. Something's determined by another. But actually, it's about the best way to think of it is a concept with boundaries. It's not something else. And the determinant is created by negativity. So that will help you over that. Then
in terms of semiotics, building off of like seminars we've done, there's the diachronic and then there's the synchronic, right? And the diachronic would be like that linear, right? Progression. That's kind of like determination in the sense of this causes that. But the synchronic is like, yeah, but it makes sense given these other things around it at that time, right?
Right. Then, so you basically, let's say you have the continuous whole. The negation breaks it apart into determinations. And then we can talk about mediation. Basically, the world as we apprehend it, we don't, and what we're reading this week, it really works this over, is that in natural consciousness, in sense certainty, we all think that we just approach the world as it is. It's immediately understandable. It's a seamless movement, and it's uncomplicated. And Hegel will go into real detail about how mediations, distinctions, about time and space, the this and now, how these concepts are in the background structuring everything, that there really isn't an immediate non-mediated experience of the world. And through an immanent critique, he shows how sense certainty unravels, and how behind its back, as he puts it, all sorts of things are going on, and how sense certainty will favor the object for a while, then it will favor the knower or the subject, and then it will favor the whole. It'll actually do this circle. It starts out with the whole, breaks it up, favors one over the other, and then comes back to the whole. And this is something we're going to see over and over again through Hegel, that there is a departure and a return at a higher level through negation. And what are some of the practical implications? Well, you can approach the world in a more nuanced way in terms of political ideologies. You can do an immanent critique of a political ideology, see some of the operative moments, some of the concepts, how they are driven by negative tensions. You can abstract some of these. Republicans are really good at this, for instance. Republicans will take something like Bruce Springsteen's song, Born in the USA, rip it out of its context, and turn it into a conservative rallying cry, which pisses off Bruce Springsteen, pisses off my sense of propriety, and then I'm just left in wonder at the genius that they're able to accomplish by doing this. And so it helps you understand about subject formation, identity. You're basically able to look at the world and realize that there are things within a certain thought construct or social construct that have both a positive and negative side. You can appropriate those, and the energy of those within your new problematic will still be there as an implicit part of the mix, sublated, as Hegel will say, which is classically termed as a canceling out, and as an acceptance. So, so in terms of the other, I guess just basically making the political connection, I think that's a real important practical one. But in terms of this is going to get too far flung. I think I'll just leave it there. But I think it has implications for the way we approach the findings of neuroscience, that neuroscience, for all of its specificity and scientific accuracy, is really dealing with the world at a level of naive realism in a lot of ways. And there's all this data, but but a lot of times this data, actually has to be some thought about what this data means for us. And instead, all the data means is what the most naive understanding sees: simple causality. So anyway, there's a lot of practical implications. So I've got all these notes, but I think that if I pay attention to them, it gets really boring. So we want to go beyond kind of witless binaries that Hegel is real critical of, something being either purely right or purely wrong, And he's not talking in terms of like some mushy, oh, we just need to get along kind of thing. He is talking about genuine complexity. One of these simple binaries that I can think of that's really injurious about something being good and bad, and we do this all the time. I have this mythology when I was a little kid and I was pre-linguistic. I actually have a memory of this. It must be a false memory that I created, but it's a myth that I love. Just to make sense of the world, I had to throw one thing into a basket that was good and another thing that was bad. And into the good basket, there were things like, there were images and feelings. There might be like an image of smiling faces. There was food I liked and tender nuzzles. That was good. In the bad pile, there were things like loud noises, sharp objects, fire. And then one day, an image of my family, it fucking duplicated and tried to go into both baskets. Whoa, wait a second. And we're all crippled by disabled by these binaries that in their simplicity offer us either ors that are, they don't resonate with the truth. And you know that the truth is greater than these simple binaries. And at least, I mean, that's the most concrete, personal way I can come up with approaching how simple binaries can, you really need them. Hegel says the understanding, where you have things that are clearly delineated, it's brilliant. You can't do it. You can't do without it, but you just can't stay there either. And so that's another thing that I think it's good to keep in mind. You really approach situations imminently looking for the undercurrent of these sublations, these negativities, these contradictions, and find a way that leads out of them. Particular shape of consciousness will not necessarily do this on its own. We as phenomenologists from a distance can sort of see this happening from a distance, and spirit itself, the kind of the collective product and possession of humanity as a whole, which is unevenly tapped into by all of us, will experience these transitions from one shape of consciousness to another. Once again, Hegel starts with the real world. He takes it seriously. He does an immanent critique of sense certainty. He thinks we haven't earned the right to leap ahead yet, to impose anything on sense certainty. And I know that he's asking us to do something impossible, but at least as a thought experiment, it's good to try and stick with that. You'll see that universal concepts are implied. I've gone over a lot of this already. Then there's, we see that consciousness is somehow undermining itself, and it's inadequate to its task. And that Hegel has mentioned how it's, I think in last week's read, it might have been in the preface, he mentioned it as a splinter in your heart that nags you, which is so reminiscent of the splinter in your mind out of the Matrix that, is it Morpheus? What's his name? Talks about. But that the shape of consciousness, the spirit itself is driven by this need to be comprehensive, this need to figure things out. And the interesting thing about this circularity deal is that when you begin with sense certainty, there's this beautiful immediacy, and everything makes sense. And opposites are united. Opposites really in sense certainty really aren't really even stated. They're hardly there, although there is an implication in the background that plays itself out. Eventually, through all these shapes, these moments of consciousness within shapes of consciousness are refining human understanding. And then finally, when you get to the absolute, in a way you've returned to the immediacy of sense certainty. You have there's the immediate certainty we begin with. There's this slaughterhouse of history. This is not all just thought. In human history, spirit and the contradictions play out. But this immediate certainty reappears at the end in the absolute, but it's not this empty certainty that Hegel criticizes in the beginning, that it's an immediacy you can't see anything about. It's an immediacy that is rich with all the sublations, with the negations that have happened throughout human history. It's brimming with the energy of this accumulated experience, human experience, and knowing, which is what's been going on all along, knows itself with certainty in immediacy. So when Hegel says that you end where you started, you don't have to see that as being, I think, grossly teleological. You can see that there's a form of immediacy and certainty that spirit has always wanted to get back to, and personalizing spirit. Hey, I don't know how else to do it. And that this immediacy and certainty is achieved in the absolute at the end. And it's sort of like at the end of Wizard of Oz, where Dorothy comes back and she goes, I had this incredible journey, and you were there, Schelling, and you were there, Plato, and you were all there. And there's no place like home. Spirits returned to this. And, this is sort of my own poetic reductionism here. But, yeah, Hegel does kind of say that. And that's what the commentators say. I read it in Hippolyte just last night. So, but anyway, that's just my introduction to this. I think that I just hope that if there's some of these basic parts of the conceptual apparatus that you don't understand, you can come up with at least your own tentative understanding. So when you're going through this book, you're not just stumped and aren't able to follow the progression. But there are a lot of things laid out at the very beginning that just keep repeating in different forms throughout. And in terms of what we're going to do the rest of the time here, I think that if people have questions about concepts they want to clarify or they want to expound upon, or paragraphs that they think are particularly salient, this would be a good way to continue. There's certain paragraphs that are just pregnant with everything he wants to say.
Tyler is
Go ahead, Tyler.
with us now too. I think.
Oh, is Tyler here?
Yeah.
Oh, he joined at least.
Hello? Hello?
Hi, Tyler.
Hey, you guys hear me?
We can hear you. We can't see you.
Oh, let me see. That helps?
Yeah.
Yep. That's great.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, I think that was really good. I really enjoyed all the stuff in development. I was just going to share something kind of like a funny quote that Hegel said relatively early on in his career. I think it's pretty insightful. This is from a text called Introduction to the Critical Journal of Philosophy. And this was a text that he co-authored with Schelling. It was sort of like a journal that was mostly sort of Schelling's thing, and Hegel did a lot of the grunt work because he was basically an adjunct. And so they would occasionally co-publish stuff that was mostly published by Hegel. In any case, the thing that I wanted to share that I thought was helpful and sort of touches on some of the themes that were just talked about was this. I just typed it in voice chat. So, quote, "We need a roundabout way to sneak the absolute in." In a way, you could characterize that as what the phenomenology is trying to do. If you're interested in getting more of the context of the quote, I'll just put a couple of the lines if you wanted to read that. But I don't think it's really necessary for this moment. But what I see Hegel is trying to do here is say, look, you know, we're finite sort of creatures, right? We deal with finite stuff. We don't normally traffic in the sort of language, you know, the absolute this and spirit that, and we're not sort of born Hegelians, right? And so it's perfectly appropriate if the preface of the introduction that you're having like a ton of difficulty because we're trying to sort of get some sort of sight about what the whole is, right? But hey, as we spent a lot of time last time talking about, you don't really get a sight of the whole without going through all the parts, right? And so if our sort of characterizations of Hegel's system as a whole are like kind of difficult, that's perfectly appropriate for where we are because we're trying to see pretty far ahead at this point, right? But the way that I see the importance of the quote about needing a roundabout way to sneak the absolute in is that we have to begin, as Bert was just saying, with finite consciousness and our ordinary natural assumptions. Hegel doesn't intend, as Bert was saying, to begin with something like an absolute principle or something like that, and then deductively demonstrate the rest of the world from that principle. That would be something more akin to like Fichte or Schelling. Instead, he wants to begin with just ordinary everyday thinking and demonstrate that ordinary everyday thinking, ordinary consciousness ultimately necessarily leads itself into philosophical consciousness. And so this is good not only for ordinary consciousness because it gets this, you know, it comes to know itself and all this kind of good stuff, right? It's also an important justification for philosophical consciousness, right? We need to make sure that we're not bullshitted, you know? We're not just sort of like the dictates of philosophical consciousness, what we're trying to do, it needs to answer to a demand that really does show up in everyday life. And as hard as Hegel is, that's ultimately what he's trying to do, is he's trying to show that it solves very concrete, important demands for everyday life. And so I think that this sort of language about needing to sneak the absolute in really kind of shows Hegel's intentions. Begin with ordinary finite consciousness and then show how, by its own lights, that finite consciousness has to equip itself with all the philosophical machinery that we've been kind of talking about and how it's going to do so over a very long period of time. But I've always really loved that quote because, I don't know, something about sneaking the absolute is like awesome to me. And so I thought I'd share it. I think it might be helpful for other people. also, if you have like a lot of Kant background and you're like kind of wondering how does Hegel do all the stuff that he's doing with phenomenology, doesn't this break all the rules that Kant talked about, then reading that critical journal, the introduction for the critical journal of philosophy would be really good, because it's Schelling and Hegel basically talking about why they're not Kantians. And so it might be helpful if you have that kind of background. If you don't, then I don't think you need to read it at all. But that phrase is really cool, so I thought I'd share it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, you too.
Well, in terms of, is the absolute a myth that has to exist so we have something to shoot for? It's just, I'm wondering how to grasp the absolute. Could you just consider the absolute truth? I know that in this week's reading, Hegel equates the absolute with truth, and he uses it both as something that exists right now that you strive for, or that the object is the absolute. It's where the truth is, or is it the absolute way at the end of the line through a long process of development?
Yeah, I think that this is an interesting question. I think it's especially interesting the way that you phrase the question, right? Can we grasp the absolute? And, you know, the word for concept, or as Miller has it, notion, is begriff, which refers to kind of grasping, right? And so this is sort of the Hegelian question in a lot of ways. Like, is the absolute something that's graspable, conceptualizable, all that kind of stuff? And at the end of the day, Hegel's answer is yes. And, you know, he doesn't provide anything like an argument in the introduction that's like, okay, here's why in principle this sort of thing is possible, because that would begin with all the sort of assumptions about finite rationality and all that kind of stuff that we're really not supposed to start with, right? We're just supposed to start with the most ordinary perspective that we can possibly get. But at the end of the day, I think that Hegel's position is that and this is sort of what absolute idealism means, is that the absolute is knowable in principle. So we don't know everything about the world. Hegel didn't think that he knew everything about the world, but that there's nothing like a sort of fundamental gap or something like that that we could never in principle know anything about. Hegel thinks that ultimately this is sort of paradoxical and self-undermining to postulate that sort of thing. In the introduction, he talks about how this would involve a really inadequate understanding of what truth is, right? Because then we'd have to say, well, you know, what we're saying, it's true, but it's not absolutely true, or something like that. But that doesn't really make any sense, right? We need to already have an understanding of what it would mean for something to be absolutely true in order to be able to judge our knowledge against it, right? And so I think at the end of the day, the way that Hegel going to argue is that there aren't these sort of fundamental gaps in our knowledge. There might be certain empirical gaps, like we don't know everything about the world, but that doesn't stop us from, in principle, knowing like all of the fundamental features of reality are cognizable in one way or another.
Well, I was going to say, I don't know if this is exactly consistent with the text, but one way that you could understand that whole thing is, you know, because, I'm sorry, I'm really tired, so I'm trying to remember, like, I don't remember the paragraph or anything. But when Hegel says that we're trying to get from, like, philosophy, which is love of knowing, to knowing itself, philosophy is love of wisdom. Like, not, that's the root of that word, not necessarily love of knowing, but he's playing off of that. And so I almost wonder what the word for knowing is, and like anyone can answer like after I'm saying this thing. But like I think that in that process of differentiation and gaining knowledge and like knowing happening, right, that one might arrive at wisdom that is coming back to a view of the whole or the object in this way where you've learned how it doesn't work, you've learned how maybe it does work. I just think that there's like a lot of actual wisdom in Hegel when he's talking about this, in the sense that it corresponds to truth. Like, wisdom is what corresponds to truth, but like conceptualizing wisdom is difficult, because when you just say it as like a sentence or like put it into a formula or something, it gets very reduced, right? If you don't actually have that lived experience or that thought behind the wisdom you've arrived at, it's sort of an empty phrase, right? So the actual wisdom isn't really conceptualizable, because you have to go through the whole thing to actually arrive at the wisdom. The wisdom isn't just like a phrase, right? So I'm thinking of this in terms of like, maybe even cultural design or criticism, or like collective evolution almost. I know it sounds super new agey, but in the sense that with our civilizations, when we have these kind of, like you're saying, slaughterhouses of differentiation or contradiction, what we actually gain from those experiences after having gone through them, like learning how not to be and how possibly to be, we could call that wisdom. And maybe the absolute is sort of mythological, but I don't know. I guess I don't know all the right like words yet and everything, and I know all the differentiations are important, but I keep coming to the same pattern in my thought, and I guess I've just been a Hegelian almost my whole life. Not really. But there's like this movement, right? And I can't help but think that sometimes this conversation gets displaced into terms of like knowledge, like linguistic knowledge, almost like I don't know, language, right? And I don't think of this as language, right? The movements of thought are not necessarily just language. It's ways of being and acting and knowing. Those things are all kind of bound up together in very specific ways. And I wish I had better vocabulary to talk about it, and that's partially why I'm super excited to read all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'm approaching it with a far too simplistic concept, but so far, how I understand the absolute is just simply the dialectical, organic unity of all the various shapes of consciousness, how they all fit together. And absolute knowing would be the absolute coming to recognize itself through finite human beings as the systematic, organic, moving, dialectical totality of shapes of consciousness that it is.
Yes, that's kind of what I was thinking, I guess. And then in the kind of religious almost questions about all of this, about the absolute, or more about spirit coming to know itself. Am I saying that right?
Yes.
Okay. Spirit coming to know itself. I feel like there's because what Hegel does start with sense certainty, and for myself and my own experiences of my own most sensuous, like embodied, immediate experiences that just, they make that intuitive sense and you can't really differentiate things, but you seem to understand it, right? In those moments, they are sort of religious moments for me, in the sense that you feel something, and it's moving through you, and it's moving through living beings, and maybe even it's moving through what we consider non-living beings. And I guess like you don't have to have any sort of specific religious connotations to say that there is some sort of force what does he call it? Like an intensive force almost moving throughout history and throughout human beings.
You know, and I'm not sure, Tyler could say more about this, but I think you're describing a kind of feeling of the absolute that Schelling does, that Schelling thinks that somehow art captures. I'm not real clear on that. I just kind of read that somewhere in passing. Not sure if that's right, but I'm not sure if Hegel does something with that, because this does seem to operate at the level of thought or reason and not feeling or emotion. But I think the question of how does emotion or feeling play into this is very relevant. Tyler, do you know if Hegel ever addressed this?
Yeah, I mean, so one thing to keep in mind is that the very last chapter before absolute knowing or whatever is the chapter on religion. And so Hegel really does think that religion basically embodies a non-conceptual knowledge of the absolute. And here, the absolute isn't, I don't know, like some spooky thing that you don't really understand or something like that. It just is a whole range, domain of sense-making practices, right? Christianity, if you're a believer, isn't just about like having a God figure or something like that. It's an entire conception regarding the way the universe works, your role within it, the way that social institutions are meant to embody their roles, etc. And so that's, I think, the sense in which Hegel says that religions embody sort of pre-theoretical or pre-cognitive knowledge of the absolute. And he thinks that they do so in sort of developmental stages. And so maybe one way that you can critique Hegel, one way that in which Hegel's kind of Eurocentrist, is he thinks that it's going to bottom out in Protestant Christianity. And Protestant Christianity is the closest system, and so really Protestant Christianity is just a preconceptual way of talking about Hegel, all that kind of stuff. I don't know what people might think of that. We haven't really gotten to the arguments for why that's the case, so maybe that seems ridiculous or inappropriate or something like that. But I think that's Hegel's mature view. I also think, so you mentioned the word for knowledge in Hegel. So I think most like non-English languages have like two words for what we normally mean by knowledge. So like in German, the way this works is kennen, which is like to know, like I know that person, like to recognize almost. Whereas this refers to the kind of knowledge that we have like in universities. And so Hegel, that's just kind of regular German. Hegel uses this. But I think the most important thing about Wissen and Hegel's usage of it is that it implies a heavily systematic understanding of knowledge. It's not just that I know that something. It's not like I just know Jasmine or something like that. It's the sort of systematic embodied knowledge from identity. I don't know if it's helpful for people. But... Oh, and you said about Schelling. Schelling does think that art sort of gives you a way into the absolute. It's a different way to sneak yourself in. And Hegel, in general, one way of parsing the difference is Schelling thinks that you start with the absolute. That you have some intuition. I'll call it an intellectual intuition, and you just really feel the absolute in that way. And then afterwards, you can kind of, through a glass darkly, express this somewhat through conceptual knowledge. Hegel rejects this. Hegel thinks that you can actually talk about the absolute in purely intelligible terms, and you're not like losing anything.
Tyler, just as a side note, is it also right to say that for Schelling, this kind of intellectual intuition of the absolute really belongs to the exceptional individual, the genius, not everybody's going to have it. Whereas with Hegel, he's far more democratic. He thinks everyone can work their way up to absolute knowing if they choose to.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. I mean, Hegel thinks that all this stuff is universal, right? Anybody can do this. Anybody can arrive at the standpoint that he has reached or something like that. Is his belief. He doesn't think everyone, in fact, will or something like that. There's not going to be Hegel churches, which is why he thinks religion will continue to be around, even though he's already thought through all of the fundamental implications of Protestant religion. But yeah, hopefully that's helpful. Also, just to keep in mind, there's like a whole bunch of Schelling, and he's really, really inconsistent. And Hegel kind of burned him and said that Schelling conducted his philosophical education in public. And so it can be really hard to pin down one position that Schelling had, because he had at least 4 or 5 different phases in his career, whereas at most other philosophers have.
Do you happen to know
Hold on, Michael.
Okay.
We've got like 4 people trying to talk right now, so
okay.
We'll go Jonathan, Sammy.
Just super fast on the point. At the end of the preface, he says that in order for it to actually be successful in real science, it has to be expressible in a way that everyone would be able to see it. Because if it's only something that one individual has, or only a specific set, like a special group of people have, it's not really science. It's just this sort of group thing, or this group thought.
I wanted to speak from the perspective of art, actually, because I was talking to Vico about this last week. And he's an experienced artist. I'm just, I guess, somewhat of an artist. And, like, the experience of creating, especially a piece of visual art, but maybe even other mediums, he's like, I don't think that all this thinking necessarily helps you. Like, you cannot prepare to make the work of art in the sense that when you overplan and you try to divide everything up and differentiate it all, it can destroy the painting. That's why a computer can scan a famous work of art and then try to reproduce that style with mathematics, but it's never going to have the dynamism or the vitality of the original painting, right? Because there's kind of a margin of like human error and expressiveness. Now, but then the interesting thing is and I don't know, I'm not going to say I agree with Schelling, like I know what I'm talking about, but when because when people have done mathematical, and I'm going to really think of math as science in the sense it's one of the most systematic bodies of knowledge, right? It's kind of the essence of systemic knowledge, in that you get formulas for how this thing happens. When people have analyzed different artists' work, like Jackson Pollock or Van Gogh are the most famous ones, with they've scanned it and done mathematical analyses, they see these patterns, they're like, oh, this is the pattern of turbulence, we can express this in a formula. But Van Gogh wasn't sitting there getting that formula and then trying to transcribe it. He created through his body, same with Jackson Pollock, even more so. He was very, very dynamic in his movements. And they ended up creating this pattern that's mathematically expressible. And so I guess what my experience is really that sense certainty or sense experience, and then that creative aspect of it where you're kind of playing around in it seems almost to be the origin point. And then you can, I don't want to say abstract, but like pull out the essential and then create mathematical, like a sort of scientific science of what you just did. But now the science, it just can't come first. So I don't know if it's like we have the absolute beforehand, but I do know for a fact not everyone can paint turbulence, like the mathematical formula for turbulence. Like that takes a kind of genius, a kind of knowing of a certain kind of perhaps like emotional pain, because the only time he painted that way was when he was institutionalized and in a lot, very deeply depressed and in despair. So if we have this specific group of people, or maybe even a specific genius who can do this, you can still take the science. You can still take a scientific frame of mind and lift the essence out, right, and actually develop it. That doesn't mean that I don't know what all that means. It's just
when we talked about this earlier this week, we also talked about how, and I think this was part of your conversation with Vico, who is watching right now. He's just not in the normal chat, even though we have room if he wants to join there. But he said he's just listening anyway. But I think part of it was also that, but you can, really benefit as an artist by learning the, theorems and formulas and practicing that kind of stuff. But then you have to go back into just the art itself. But there's this kind of what's the Hegelian word, sublation, right?
Yeah.
Where that thing that you've gone and grinded out, now you've learned this new calculus or what have you, or something. It somehow is going to be kind of internalized and now just imminent to your actual project creation.
Yeah, it joins your intuitive body of almost motor memory, like a muscle memory even.
Yeah. One really fast point. Hegel talks in the preface about the difference of mathematical knowledge and how mathematics does knowledge in a way that's different from philosophy, and he's kind of putting down the notion of making philosophy mathematical. So that might be an area to think about in terms of where we look at science trying to make calculable things, whereas there may be a different process that Hegel is pointing to as the process of development of consciousness. One of the parts that I like, and it's in the sense certainty part, is where and maybe this is jumping pretty far ahead in the process, but when he's talking about trying to return to sense certainty after you come to understand the series of moments that sort of makes up the development of consciousness, you have to go and embody the I that points to the now that is night. And the problem that he points out with that is that, if you keep trying to point at now, it's always a new now that you're embodying a new now, which is the now that's pointing, but also you're never quite pointing to that old now that it was night. You're constantly trying to get there, but you can't quite get there. And so from my understanding of that, he uses that as, and he says something about the pointing, the thing that's reflected in itself. And the pointing out is the experience of learning that now is a universal, which is in the process of doing the pointing, you're pointing at the individual things of pure immediacy, but what you're discovering in attempting to point at the now is that the now is a universal, that instead there is some universal concept of now that you're trying to constantly get to with pure immediacy. And so it's this movement from the now as the purely immediate to the now as movement of various moments and the absolute plurality.
Is that paragraph 96?
It's paragraph, and again, it's jumping way forward, 107. In this pointing out, then, we see merely a movement which takes the following course. So try to point at now, but never getting to now, and then recognizing in the act of doing the pointing that the pointing out is the experience of learning that now is a universal. So this movement from the pure immediacy of trying to point to recognizing it as a movement of a series of moments and the absolute plurality. And so that's something where I sort of see in attempting to deal with the problem, like the temporality of embodying pure immediacy after the development of consciousness, is sort of the image of the development of consciousness, which is trying to seek pure immediacy, finding it sort of failure in the ability to do so, and then having that further develop what is a sense of the things that we perceive.
Very well said.
Yeah.
I was going to suggest two things. One is, so we have lots of these questions like, what is the difference between an idea and a notion or a concept, which notion means concept, right, for Hegel here. And a lot of people talk about that being a regrettable translation, but whatever. So concept, notion and idea, the difference between that. And we've got all those other questions from the survey, and we can, kind of talk about those, but also like, there's It'd be nice to kind of dive a lot deeper into what John was just talking about, but I'm wondering if we should do a little bit with the introduction first to like say anything about it before we move into that. What does he achieve or accomplish, in the introduction?
So you're saying do the introduction, then we can move to questions.
Well, one of the
Let's try out
questions
things that we should do.
I liked one of the questions, even though I didn't have a good grasp of how to answer it, or the difference between what's happening in the preface and what's happening in the introduction. I think that might be a way to do both, deal with one of the questions, but then also talk about what's happening in the introduction.
Well, I think that in the introduction, he says we assume that there's this unbridgeable gap between knowing and the object, and knowing the object. Knowing and the act of knowing and the object. Is it an instrument? Is there a medium? And the futility of this gap, there are various responses to it, all of which Hegel pretty much doesn't like, other than seeing that in a way it's a non-problem, that it is all happening within consciousness in one way or another. The object is constituted in consciousness. The dichotomy is constituted within consciousness, and it can be overcome. But I know he's being critical of people who just want to ignore the gap and just go on happily, people who want to, maybe like Schelling, have a more Spinozist sense that it's part of a seamless unity that you can't say much about necessarily, or people that want to go even further back into religion. Those are all the things that Hegel doesn't want to do. And the whole phenomenology is about addressing this gap, I think.
Jacob's got
A fist.
a fist question about the introduction.
Okay, so my question revolves around section 78 and 79. And there are a couple things in here that I have a question about, but I want to, I want to read off a section starting on page 50. There is a sentence that starts the skepticism. It's about 2/3 of the way down the page.
Okay.
So I want to read from there until the end of section 79. And it goes, the skepticism that is directed against the whole range of phenomenal consciousness, on the other hand, renders the spirit for the first time competent to examine what truth is. For it brings about a state of despair about all the so-called natural ideas, thoughts, and opinions, regardless of whether they are called one's own or someone else's. Ideas with which the consciousness that sets about the examination of truth straightway is still filled and hampered, so that it is, in fact, incapable of carrying out what it wants to undertake. The necessary progression and the interconnection of the forms of the unreal consciousness will by itself bring to pass the completion of the series. To make this more intelligible, it may be remarked in a preliminary and general way that the exposition of the untrue consciousness in its untruth is not a merely negative procedure. The natural consciousness itself normally takes this one-sided view of it. So that part in particular was interesting because I think I did have that sort of one-sided view of the negative procedure. But I think what follows is pretty interesting to me. And a knowledge which makes this one-sidedness its very essence is itself one of the patterns of incomplete consciousness which occurs on the road itself, and will manifest itself in due course. This is just the skepticism which only ever sees pure nothingness in its results and abstracts from the fact that this nothingness is specifically the nothingness of that from which it results. For it is only when it is taken as the result of that from which it emerges that it is, in fact, the true result. In that case, it is itself a determinate nothingness, one which has a content. The skepticism that ends up with the bare abstraction of nothingness or the emptiness cannot get any further from there, but must wait to see whether something new comes along, and what it is, in order to throw it too into the same empty abyss. But when, on the other hand, the result is conceived as it is in truth, namely as determinate negation, a new form has thereby immediately arisen, and in negation the transition is made through which the progress through the complete series of forms comes about of itself. Now, after that I said, how? That was my question. How does the negation not result in a determinate nothingness, but rather in something that is immediately conceived? This really confused me, because the negative is leading to a positive here, right? The negative is leading to something positive, and it isn't clear to me where that positive is occurring. If there is no affirmation, unless there's an implicit affirmation assumed in the negation. So this really confused me, and I wonder if part of it has to do with identity of the thing. And I'm curious how identity plays in Hegel, because I'm coming from like a Deleuzean background, which is very critical of identity, and I'm wondering how the transition via negation fits within like an identitarian framework, because he does seem to be proposing some sort of philosophy of becoming via negation. But I'm just curious to how that works, and that might come about later. But it just didn't make sense to me, this idea of this determinate negation, which led to something positive. And I'm wondering if anybody has thoughts or could shed light on that.
You know, I mean, what comes to mind for me is that when we're talking about a determinate negation, and I mean, forgive me for using the standard terms, the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, but I think right here it can be somewhat helpful. A certain mode of consciousness runs into a deadlock, and this deadlock, this contradiction, this tension is precisely what brings it, in a sense, to a screeching halt, that negates it. But it's negating it in a determinate way. But at the same time, there's some aspect of each mode of consciousness that's preserved. And it's precisely in the fact that there is a certain positive content of each shape of consciousness that is getting negated. It's that negative moment that's refashioning a certain positive content. And in refashioning it, it gives rise to a new shape of consciousness or synthesis, which in turn runs into another internal determinate negation or deadlock, which keeps this process going. But some aspect of each shape of consciousness is preserved in the shape of consciousness that follows, but it's been negated in another sense. And that's how this morphological process is unfolding. That's how I understood it.
I just wanted to add that's exactly what I was getting from that too, Michael. But I just wanted to clarify real quick, because before I even touched any of this, the whole thesis, antithesis, synthesis thing really to me was like, I was thinking of it almost like these like political terms, right? There's a group that says this thing, there's a group that says no, it's this way. Then they fight it out, and something comes out of it where they like compromise, right? Which is actually not at all what he's saying in this sort of movement of thought. It's definitely, I really love this section on skepticism, because I have several friends who got stuck in skepticism, and what it does whenever it looks at any sort of system, and skepticism can't see the things it presupposes and presumes, right? Because it feels like it's occupying this complete negativity. And it just looks at something, it says that entire system has this flaw, throw it out, it's wrong, throw it into the abyss. And then it sits there and waits until something arbitrarily comes along. It's like, let's look at this. Oh, a flaw, throw it into the abyss. And what determinate negation to me is saying, I see this flaw, and I think that it's kind of this constitutive, it's part of the very makeup of your system. And so what if we what if I point that out? I'm negating your system. I'm saying it has this gap or this sort of error. How can we rearrange? And this is the point of natality to me, like the point of Genesis almost, right? This is where something new comes in. And it's not just rearranging the old system at all. The negation itself is that spark of Genesis of something new, right? And I'm only thinking about it in that way because of Arendt, who's really preoccupied with natality. And I was always it just burned in my mind. I was like, where does that happen? When? What is newness? Where does something unfold into more? Where does something become a new pattern or, because that's kind of an essential question for our day and age. We're stuck in a lot of just tolemizations of old ways of thinking that is, I feel like our entire social order is about to crumble, right? And so where does something new, a new order come in? And I guess the answer is you can't exactly pinpoint the second it happens, but it has something to do with negation, right? It happens because of a determinate negation. Yeah.
I have a quote I want to touch on that just goes right with what you're saying about skepticism, unless what you're going to say is on skepticism too.
I am on page 51, and So
actually, that's mine is at the very top of page 52, so it's probably goes right into that. So.
Okay. Well, I'm thinking that on about half, just above paragraph 80, he'll say that there's a skepticism that ends up with the bare abstraction of nothingness or emptiness that really can't do anything. But there's a determinate nothingness, one which has content. So there's this not this that's incredibly relevant. It's almost like this big vacuum that's waiting to be filled. Maybe this determinate nothingness, one which has content, it's sort of like this this space that is there to be filled with positivity, which goes in with Michael's mentioning about the thesis antithesis synthesis thing, which of course is vastly overused, but that's one way of looking at that. But basically, it just seems like the determinate nothingness, which has content, has the possibility of being a new positive, which is what takes you out of this dead end. It's not yet.
Also,
He
can be.
He gets a real good bash in on the sort of self-congratulatory incredulity of the skeptic, right? That considers itself to be kind of onto something or ahead of the curve because it doesn't believe in the stuff that you believe, right? So, and that we already touched on 50. It said that skepticism. So he does like it because it definitely sets the stage for being able to get to the truth. But on 52, he's talking about the unique truth of vanity. He says this conceit. So this is right above 81. Do you want to read it?
Yeah. Then we have two fingers, I think.
So really quick, just a side note, Jacob, we're not going to be looking at the screen very much, and you don't have to use hand signals or words. You can just kind of interject, because we're about half the size we were last week, so it should be easier Yeah, for y'all. But Sammy's gonna read
Okay.
this.
Okay.
This conceit, which understands how to belittle every truth in order to turn back into itself and gloat for its own understanding, which knows how to dissolve every thought and always find the same barren ego instead of any content, this is a satisfaction which we must leave to itself, for it flees from the universal and seeks only to be for itself. Yeah. I was like,
Boom.
It's atheist.
Yeah.
So I just had like a follow-up question to the initial question, and this is something that I was thinking about last week as well. So if the movement or the becoming takes place through negation, I'm curious whether there is any sort of freedom for agents within this system, aside from the act of negation itself, or whether there is an agental, like, implicit affirmation within the negation, right? Because if your act is simply to negate something, then you don't affirm what comes afterwards, unless you're selecting certain things to affirm within that act of negating. So if you simply, so let's like take capitalism. If we were just to negate capitalism, that action doesn't like affirm anything to come afterwards. So there isn't any positive movement or agental freedom to decide what comes afterwards if the action is purely negative. So I'm wondering if there is a freedom to choose what comes after that negation, or whether it's just more or less chaotic, or determined by something outside. So like we can think about the French Revolution or something as an act of negating the system that came before it. But what happened after the French Revolution, at least initially, when you had the Reign of Terror, or Napoleon, or all these different things that were probably not, that kind of just sprung out in a way that didn't fit with the ideals of the French Revolution. You can see that the act of pure negation, there's not like a freedom involved in that action. It seems sort of determined or chaotic. And I'm wondering if there is freedom in Hegel, or whether it's just a determinism.
Okay, I see Tyler's about to talk about it. I just wanted to say I think that the answer to that is contained in that very section, because the kind of negation that has absolutely no, I don't want to say suggestions, but I don't, like with your example of capitalism, let's say you could take a specific aspect, a specific impact that the system of capitalism has, a specific flaw that like is a contradiction that causes all these things, and you say, what if instead of like that's wrong, and if in that moment of like negating that, if as let's just say imagine there was like mass protests and we're all, but it's not just like we hate capitalism, down with it, oh now we don't know what to do, it's like we want this thing to stop, that shifts the form, you know, like the kind of negation that has content is not just like a sort of chaotic negation, but it is a risk because you don't actually know what will come afterwards. I mean,
so consider like you could critique capitalism on the basis of you know, it's an unjust class system, blah blah blah, right? And you can go in a Marxist direction, or you could say that capitalism is vain in the eyes of God, and you could critique capitalism from that direction. You could say that capitalism dissolves the bonds of the family, and that's really important, and blah 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 blah, right? But the point is that for each of these critiques of capitalism, they all imply a positive vision of what the good society looks like, right? In the Marxist conception, it means that a society without class oppression. If that's going to imply some very, you know, positive characteristics of a society without capitalism, so too with the person that thinks that, oh, it means we're moving away from God, blah, 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 or the person that thinks that it dissolves family bonds or something like that, right? That would be a move, you know, towards the right, if you prefer that sort of terminology or something like that. But I think it's a very specific case in which the sort of criticism that you make about capitalism is dialectically intertwined with how it is that you imagine a good society is, or something like that. I think it's also worth considering that, like, Hegel doesn't see, in fact, the whole point, arguably, is that Hegel doesn't see negativity and positivity as fundamentally distinct phenomena in the way that Deleuze will sort of treat these terms. Though, you know, you could quibble with that characterization of Deleuze, whatever. Not our purposes for now. Hegel's whole point is to show how positive features or facets of a given society arise out of arise developmentally out of previous problems, right? And that's sort of, I think, what the determinate negation stuff is really meant to get at. And so, along with this, I think Hegel, so I mean, at least by his own lights, Hegel certainly saw himself as an advocate for freedom, and he thought freedom was quite important. And so there's like huge debates about, is Hegel a kind of compatibilist? What sort of theory of freedom does Hegel have? That's a very complicated question. But I think that what's I think clearly the case, what all of the German idealists are trying to do is they're trying to give you a system of human freedom. They're trying to think that systematicity and freedom don't actually come apart, but are actually integrally related to one another. And, you know, in this case, I think this is what makes the German idealist tradition distinctively German idealist, right? In the case of Kant, you can't act freely without acting in the name of the moral law, or you can't act freely without giving yourself a reason. While Hegel will disagree with the Kantian formulation of the categorical imperative, Hegel does think that your freedom actually relies on a whole bunch of material conditions. Like, you're only free if you're a developed adult. You're only free if you live in a society that affords you a certain kind of freedom. And so, unlike other philosophers who will tend to think of freedom as sort of binary status, you're either free like human beings, or you're not free like rocks and atoms and phenomena like that, Hegel wants to give a developmental account of freedom where you can take account of the fact that there are certain beings that seem to have some kind of freedom, like biological entities, and then there are human beings, adult human beings with no developmental disorders, blah, 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 that seem to have a lot of freedom, right? And Hegel sees himself as very much in the Aristotelian tradition, like de anima, and doing this sort of thing. Hopefully that's helpful.
I had a little bit coming back to skepticism, but Mike, did you still have a point you wanted to make? It was a while.
All I was going to throw in about skepticism was I see the one form of skepticism corresponding to what Hegel calls understanding, which deals with very binary logic, either ors. And so this first type of skepticism says, this worldview, this position runs smack dab into a contradiction. Therefore, it's nothingness, the end of story, end of discussion, right? Whereas a skepticism that approaches things from the position of reason is going to see in a contradiction, again, Hegel will call this speculation. It's going to see this contradiction as a moment in which something new can come out of it, a new synthesis, a new position can arise out of it, and the story keeps going. And it's on that mechanism of determinate negation that speculation is kind of zeroing in, whereas skepticism, and so skepticism that's speculative is going to zero in on that, and it's going to keep going with it, whereas skepticism that's totally locked into the understanding and how it perceives things is just going to go, oh, there's a contradiction. we're at absolute nothingness. End of story.
Yeah. So one thing that I noticed is that there's a strong contrast between two different kinds of other objects or new objects that are introduced to consciousness, and the one is this sort of bad maybe bad skepticism isn't the right term to use, but the one that we were seeing in 80.
The vain one.
Yeah, the one with the ego and that when the new object comes up, it's waiting for a new object to negate again so that we can get back to nothingness and make the nothingness happen again. And so we're waiting for a new object to come before us so we can tear it down and make it into nothing, compared to what happens towards the end of the introduction, where the new object is the being for consciousness that comes out of consciousness creating knowledge by interacting with the object in itself. And so the new object is something to continue to develop, not only to develop our knowledge of the object in itself, but also to develop stages of consciousness. And so that's where I'm seeing the developmental process of negation, where we can recognize the sort of the failures of knowledge and the interaction with the object in itself in creating this being for consciousness, which we recognize is not quite the object in itself, but creates a new object for us to engage in order to continue to develop our consciousness. And maybe in one way, sort of touching on the capitalism, the critique of capitalism, one of the pernicious powers of capitalism is that it's constantly integrating its own negations. That the problems that come up that sort of create protests or create problems or sort of eddies or dead ends or negations of capitalism, there's a lot of powerful force in the continuation of capitalism by taking those in, integrating them, and then creating a new form of capitalism in order to perpetuate the system.
In response to Jacob's question, just going back to last week at the very top of page 10, everything turns on grasping and expressing the true, not only as substance, but equally as subject. I see subject here as this process that is driven by this desire for comprehending the whole, being the whole. And so subject always exists in us individually. As people, we have this desire for comprehensiveness, and spirit as the collective expression in institutions and through history is that's also a subject. But basically, somehow, one way or the other, the same way that Hegel is smuggling the absolute in, he is smuggling the subject in here too. He definitely doesn't want to deny the subject, but he doesn't want to understand the subject in a simplistic way. But I think the subject is still there.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm with you there. And I think one of the important things too, though, is if I understand Schelling correctly, Schelling wanted to take Spinoza's idea of substance and he wanted to turn it into a kind of subject, a big subject, a kind of agency in nature that's actualizing everything. But when Hegel says subject, to paraphrase, subject is also substance, I think what he wants us to hear in that, in part, is finite individuals, us as subjects, are part of this one absolute. It's not that there's one big subject and we're like little puppets, that somehow mirror it, but, are not fully subjects. We lack agency. Subject as substance means us as individual finite substances are still, Even though we have freedom, even though we have autonomy, we are still ultimately part of this one collective absolute. So substance is substance.
Or as spirit science might say it, we are the universe coming to know itself.
Oh my god.
I'm partially joking. This is okay. I actually.
No, you're right. I think that's right on some level.
No,
that's true.
This is what I got super excited while I was reading this at work today. Because this Hegel is giving you the key to critique. Okay, so what I was saying about wisdom earlier was really like when he's critiquing people who just sort of wave their hands and put mist over things and say like that they have some sort of absolute truth or this special intuitive knowledge. When you obscure things or say them in this sort of like a little like phrase that sounds mystical, that sounds it's what gurus do. It's what comraders do. It's what all people who dabble in like those sorts of magic do, because you can interpret those things in so many ways. And that's why I was saying that whole process of coming to that understanding is part of the wisdom. You know, like if you read Hegel and then look at the phrase, we are the universe coming to know itself, it's a lot cooler than if you're just some like kid smoking pot and you're like, wow, I guess like, yeah, we kind of are, huh? Like, you know, there's a lot more richness to that wisdom if you have gone through the differential process of figuring out the how we are that, right?
Yeah, and just as Hegel basically says this himself in the Logic, he says that basically going through his system is akin to, he describes how like when a child goes to church and they have to like mouth the words, you know, they really just want to get through it. I want to be awake Sunday morning, blah, 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 right? And those words are meaningless to them, right? It is useless. But compared to at the end, whenever you're like an old man and you come to appreciate, blah, blah, blah. And so what you're now saying is like full of all this meaning, even though it's the same words, right? Hegel, this is part of Hegel's objection to like all these kinds of formalisms. They're just empty, right? It's only when you give them the sort of content by actually going through all of the various moments, blah, 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 that they end up being meaningful. I always thought this, there's this Zen koan that I've always really liked that I thought was like a very good example of the negation of the negation. The koan goes something like this. It's like, oh, there's a monk, and before he was a monk, he like looks out into the mountains and he sees mountains. And then he begins his training, you know, he looks out into the mountains and he sees nothing. You know, it's all just nothing, right? But then he completes his training, you know, he's an old man. He looks out into the mountains and what does he see? He sees mountains, right? And I think that's ultimately sort of what all of the stuff about negation of negation, all that kind of stuff. And when it's a circle where you've already arrived at the beginning, it's that now going through his training, going through those motions was crucially important, because while he said that they were mountains at the beginning, he didn't really have a full understanding about what that meant, right? His Buddhist training gave content to the originally virtually meaningless suggestion that they were mountains or whatever, right? And importantly, Hegel sees this skeptical moment. I wrote this in the chat, but I figured it is worth saying aloud. Hegel sees this kind of skeptical moment as akin to Kantian transcendental philosophy, right? And so when he is contrasting a sort of naive position with a skeptical position, this is the sort of movement that he's getting at. We begin with a really naive conception of the world, where it's like we just have a totally pre-theoretical understanding of objects around us. Then Kant enters as this sort of ultra-skeptical moment. We can never know things in themselves. We as subjects are fundamentally distinct from objects, right? And then the sort of Hegelian sublation, negation, blah, 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 image of that is then to say the overcoming of the Kantian moment isn't just a reversal into a pre-Kantian mode. It's not a return to natural understanding. It's a recognition of how is it that we as human subjects can, as part of the world, disconnect ourselves from the world? How is it that we can take this sort of position that we do where we view ourselves as distinct from the rest of the world and still be incorporated as part of the world? So how can we move past sort of Kantian transcendental skepticism without simply falling into some pre-Kantian, naive, realist sort of moment?
I just wanted to say real quick. Actually, I just sent a message today, and I figured I'd throw this out there actually to see if everyone would be interested, because at some point, I know we have to like move through the text, so we'll be dealing a lot with the text, but at some point, I think it'd be really cool, to give a presentation or like a little like sort of lecture thing on different interpretations of Taoism and like Zen Buddhism, and show this one sort of illustrated parable that I feel like almost exactly replicates Hegel's dialectic here in some ways. I don't know if anyone would be interested in that, even as just a side thing. But
I think it would be a fun side thing.
Yeah.
One thing that I was reminded of is the way Confucius uses the I Ching as a series of stages of changes, and comparing that to sort of like static material science vision in Western science. So yeah, I think that would be interesting.
So I have like 5 things. One, kind of piggybacking off of a couple of things that I just heard from Mikey and Tyler. And you especially see this, I think, in the preface, but I think he also says it in the introduction, just the idea that like, well, and actually Sammy had asked me to kind of recap saying this, but like my overly simplistic summary of the preface was that, you know, he really likes science, and he also kind of likes the new age woo-woo stuff, but he also really doesn't like certain things about those. And so he really wants to set up, I'm not doing either, but he's also kind of doing both, which is, you know, and so you know, kind of the animosity or the seeming kind of, you know, jabs at you know, the pretensions of mathematics, for instance, or of the pretensions of you know, deep wisdom that's really like empty words. In either case, you know, he wants to be able to say there's this between thing, or maybe like a synthesis, and yeah, well, that was me recapping the one thing that, and the other part was, I'm really curious to hear about people's experiences rereading the introduction and the part on sense certainty from chapter 1, because a lot of people did reread that, and I'm wondering how much clearer it's coming. And like, really, we technically have a half hour left, so we'll be able to, I think, by a couple of people maybe talking about that, then we'll be able to shift into some stuff that you have questions about.
Well, I'm dumb, so I read this one 3 times. And each time it was like reading something different. I mean, there were things that before I thought were really important. And then the second time, other things were really important. And then the third time, the first stuff was more important. There was really a dialectical thing going on here. And then I read Inwood's translation, and it was almost like a completely different book at times. In fact, there were paragraphs that were a third longer in Inwood than in Miller. So I think there was some compression going on to get to the gist of it in Miller. But I find rereading really enlightening. And I can just remember where I was sitting when I read it the first time. And now when I read it again, I go back to that first moment and realize how although how proud I was at the time, how sketchy it was. It's sort of like the difference between saying America is and walking through all 50 states and getting to the end and going, America is. It's rereading is a good thing, unless it's just going in one ear and out the other and you're overwhelmed.
Hey, Dave, I just wanted to throw this out real quick. Should we discuss quickly, because I mean, like the last 2 weeks, we've talked about the preface and the introduction, and obviously we have to, because to get some idea of how to approach the text and understand some of the basic terms. But before, the session gets out, I think we need to point out, and Bert, Tyler, you two especially can help us here. In sense certainty, what's the fundamental deadlock consciousness runs into, and how are we going to pivot from that into perception? I think that's kind of the big takeaway that we need, because I think we've talked about it, but it's really essential to zoom in on these moments of dialectical tension. Say, okay, see, here's where we run into the negativity, and here's how we're going to pivot into the next shape of consciousness. So, wondering if we could maybe talk about that rather quickly before we get done.
Well, I think sense certainty sees its object as existing immediately in an uncomplicated way, and that is clearly not true. And that cuts the ground out of sense certainty's entire notion of the true. And so it has to jockey back and forth between, well, the object is true, or the knower is true, or the entire process is true, but it's still stuck with the fact that it's asserting that everything is known immediately without the mediation of concepts. And that's not the way it is. So, but that's
right. So, for example, when consciousness points at a specific location in space and goes here, the problem with that is there's only a here in relation to a there, and on top of it, every here and every there has this universal dimension. They can all be designated as such, any location in space, right? And so these, and I'm bringing in this term because I think it's helpful, even though Hegel doesn't use it. But the term, the concept developed by Roman Jakobson, the shifter, right? Because the word I, the word you, the word here, the word now, they're all shifters. They all, in some sense, they have, based on their context, they function to point towards a specific thing given the context, but they don't have any actual individual meaning in and of themselves. Yet on the other hand, they do have this universal meaning, in the sense that I always means the singular pronoun or first person pronoun, and you is the second person pronoun. So there is this universality to them, but the way that we try to use them, we think that they have a meaning that in fact they actually don't. And we see that here with the now and the here. Hegel brings up the I too, right? That they're all attempting to say something they actually can't say.
Right? Doesn't he say on one page that the negation of the self or the subject is what fixes all of these sort of sliders? Oh, it's 64, paragraph 108. So page 64, paragraph 108. Just a few sentences down, he says, "What is pointed out, held fast, and abides is a negative this, which is negative only when the hearers are taken as they should be, but in being so taken, they supersede themselves. What abides is a simple complex of many hearers." It goes on. And it doesn't talk about the subject right here, but I maybe this is me crossing wires with, well, I read your paper earlier and you were talking about sliders and Hegel, so I was wondering if you might want to add to that.
No, just real quick, the quote that I use in the paper, I believe, is on 61. At the bottom there, that's where he's talking about the I.
Oh, I hold them fast. Right. So 101.
Okay, yeah.
That's where it was.
On the bottom of 681?
Right. So four sentences down from paragraph 101. So the question for every week, one of the questions to be asking every week, as Tyler kind of said in one of the preparation sort of talks, was that, you know, we're asking what is the deadlock or the central antinomy, and then like how does he get past that? And so I think, if I'm hearing correctly, that the sort of deadlock here is that, you know, if we want to have knowledge, and we want to build up a system, we want to start out with like most obvious or most apparent things, and that the tendency is to then just go to immediate sense certainty, right? And you know, I've had philosophical conversations with people like that, right? Where they will try to argue that, you know, look, there's not all this gray area stuff. There's just like there's truth, and there's lies, and there's right, and there's wrong. This table is right here. Yeah. You can see it. And I'm always just like, what? How did we just move from that to this? And what? How are you getting from this? How is this supposed to?
It's a movement backwards in thought almost. It's a movement from, well, let's say, where you're trying to attempt a different, like in a different pattern of consciousness or a different stage of discourse, and it's going back down to sense certainty and appealing to that, which sense certainty does. It is some sort of foundation for everything. It's like the grounds from which everything seems to spring, and that we have to, in a way, like loop around to again. But
well, is that so this is a new exercise, it's especially for me. Like, how do we figure this out? Like, what comes next in this sort of movement? But is not that argument? Isn't that, how do I put this? Basically, exactly what Hegel's saying is like, yeah, we retreat to this, saying it's the most obvious thing. Oh, this is here, right? But ultimately, that is the most abstract thing, because there is a world of thises, right? And shit, we need to now differentiate things, right? Like that seems to me like the next movement is, because it is this, it is not that this, which is the first negation. And so that's kind of how I'm thinking about it. And what I'm anticipating comes next is like the first, like, he's given us the negative is like, we have this tree, which is not the house. Oh shit, now we have words for things.
And now we're saying now, right?
Yeah,
I like how the this splits into the that and the now, right? So it's like space and time.
Tyler has something.
Okay. Sorry, Tyler.
Oh, sorry. So I think this is all really good. So yeah, that's exactly the problem, right? I want to be like, oh, it's obvious, this thing right here, you know. But then if somebody's like, well, what? You know,
what is this?
I don't have anything else to say, right? I haven't given myself any conceptual tools to like do anything at this point, right? I have what would appear to be the most concrete thing that I could refer to is really the most abstract. I don't have anything to work with at this point. The way that Hegel beginnings of books almost always goes exactly this way, where you think that you're going to start out with the most obvious thing that you possibly could, but it's so abstract, it's so impoverished that it's barely even thinking at all, right? And that's sort of the level that sense certainty is on. And so the way that it leads into the next movement is, well, okay, now I can talk about this and that, and I can talk about this because it's red, and I can talk about that because it's brown, right? And I start introducing properties. I start talking about things and their relationships to properties, and I start talking about determinate things. That's largely where perception will go. I just want to say one thing really quickly is sometimes when people are like, oh, I should read Hegel, and then they read the sense certainty chapter, and usually they don't get too much further. The takeaway that they take from the chapter is like, oh, language is like fundamentally incapable of expressing very deep things that I'm thinking or something like that. Hegel's point is the exact opposite. At one point, is that language is much more true than your intentions are, right? The point Hegel is making is not this sort of quasi-Nietzschean point that, like, I have this deep inner feeling and language and conceptual structures are really inadequate to get at what I'm getting at. No, I'm not really thinking anything at all, right? I'm not producing anything like a content, which is substantial enough to really be considered anything worthy of conceptual inquiry, right? And so I really want to warn against what I see as kind of a bad reading of this chapter, in which you think, you know, it's all about this sort of deep intention that I have that can't be expressed in language, and that's really what's meaningful and true. The whole point of what you learn is that's an incredibly impoverished conception of what truth is. We need a better conception of what truth is at the end of the day. And that's what moves you into the next section, not some lesson about the limitations of language or conceptuality or something like that.
Yeah. For me, that was one of the things that I just found really frustrating very early in Sense Certainty. We write down this truth. A truth cannot lose anything by being written down any more than it can lose anything through our perceiving it. And I'm like, no, what are you talking about? Like, writing language changes truth in so many different ways, but to then be, you know, shown like this process of pointing and how, you know, the matter of truth is something that, like, the connection between truth and language isn't something that Hegel is going to be dealing with right here. He's treating it as pretty close to one-to-one. Whereas if you're saying like, oh, well, people make these statements, but these statements are stale, so how can you even look at a statement and think that there's a value in a statement? That's definitely not what Hegel is doing, and that found it personally very frustrating.
I want to play off of what Tyler said, but I want Mikey to make his say his piece first.
Okay, no, what I was going to add is, I think we can see it like this. So in Sense Certainty, consciousness is saying this particular thing right here that I'm pointing at, this is this, right? It's alluding to this idea that it can get to this object's pure being, its hexeity, when in fact, the only type of thought that even kind of enters at this point is a universal thought, this, now, right? And so what this deadlock here, like, I'm perceiving this particular thing, but actually I'm perceiving it in the most universal terms, and so the perception is contradicting what it thinks it's perceiving, right? Or I shouldn't even say perception. The sense certainty is contradicting what it thinks it's certain of. It's going to pivot into perception where consciousness goes, okay, I'm not able to consistently or rationally to have conscious awareness of what I claim to be having conscious awareness of in sense certainty. In the next movement, it's not going to be the consciousness of the pure hexeity or thisness or individuality of the thing. It's going to be a cluster of qualities, a cluster of universals, right? That's what perception, I take it, is going to be, where, okay, this thing is red and big and made of wood, whatever cluster of qualities you want to attribute, right? So it's not saying it has access to its pure thisness or hexeity. Now it's saying that what it has experience of is a set of qualities, right?
Right. Just playing off of both of you there. The splinter in my mind is this negation of the negation thing. Right at the end of this week's reading, Hegel says that you point to the here, but as soon as you do that, it's not here. So there's one negation. And the not here is also not here. So that's, you negate that. So then you end up coming back to the here. But the here is no longer this empty universal. It's actually richer for this double negation. And I can't quite wrap my mind around that yet. But what I'm going to be working on this next week is trying to understand that process and how it's unfolding in this next reading, because that's not something I was able to nail down in this reading, but I know it's one of the most important things.
What I take it to be that the negation involves consciousness's realization that what it is intuiting is actually not pure thisness, right? It's not pure hexeity, but rather universality par excellence, right? And so because it's universality par excellence, you might as well not be perceiving or be conscious of anything at all. So that's the negative moment. The synthetic moment or the speculative moment is going to go, okay, wait a second. But if I realign how I'm viewing things, then this particular thing that I'm trying to intuit, it has a set of qualities, a set of universals, but these universals are not universality with a capital U. These are determinate universals. So there's a kind of that's the determinate moment where it's determinate universality. Like Tyler was talking about, I think this kind of mirrors the first dialectic in science of logic, where you start with pure universality, but that or pure being, and that goes right into pure nothing. But it's the mixture of the two that give you a determinate reality that you can really start to engage with and say something about, right?
So I think something really brief, but I think is helpful. One thing that Hegel says, I believe in the preface, he said, and this sounds like little, purple prose or something like that. He says the phenomenology is not a pathway of doubt, but of despair, or something like that, right? And here's what I take this to mean for how we should read all of the various sections of the phenomenology. So it's not just that we have some conception of truth, and then because we're the contingent, finite creatures that we are, we don't meet that truth, right? Instead, the very idea of truth itself has to be adjusted in each of the chapters. It's not that we, as contingent, finite knowers, whatever, fail to reach the truth. It's that the very conception of truth itself has to change, which is why the phenomenology is such an existential text. It's not just, some sort of arcane thing about knowledge or something like that. It's our very self-conception. It's our very conception of the absolute, how everything hangs together in like the most sort of fundamental sense. That's what has to shift from each section of the phenomenology. And so what happens in a sense, certainty section, is we have a certain conception of truth, whereby truth is the most concrete thing, and what we mean by the most concrete thing is the most immediately available to us, and we do that by pointing, blah, 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 right? What's proven in the sense certainty chapter is that notion of what truth is bankrupt. It's self-contradictory. It's not able to account for the very thing that it's trying to get. So we're forced to move into a new conception of the absolute, a new conception of what constitutes a true thing. And that's going to be spelled out in the details of perception, etc. And so that's the way the phenomenology is going to move. It's not just we contingently fail. It's always that the very conception of truth at play in that section is false, bankrupt, self-contradictory, etc.
I've got an immediate question about that last page. Yeah, so the last page of on 66, you wanted to point out, like, don't do that cheap reading where, that thing people do where, we're trapped in language and all that. But that is where we leave off, right? And so are you saying that that's what perception and like the whole next couple sections is supposed to be answering, right? So the sensuous this that is meant cannot be reached by language, right? And we're fully like within the universal anytime we try to speak of anything, right? Is that the problem? Is that a problem that he's going to try to get us out of through? So we went from sense certainty to now being like, no, sense certainty doesn't get us to truth. Oh, but now we're stuck in the universal. So is perception supposed to be the next move to outgrow that, or?
So Hegel develops a middle concept between universal and particular, or universal and particular, and he calls this individual. So it's not what he'll sometimes call an abstract universality, which is something so abstract that it doesn't have any content at all, right? But it's a universal, you know, you might say in a particular sense. People use a lot of jargon, say the individual is the mediation of the universal and the particular. I think that's Hegelese, right? But we can talk about universals that aren't universal in an absolute sense, right? So like red. Red is a universal in the sense that it's not just one particular thing. It's not a property of a particular thing. It's a property that inheres in a bunch of different stuff, right? But it's not universal in the sense that it's everything, right? It's not abstract or indifferent in that way, right? It's a determinate universality or a concrete universality. It's a particular thing, or a particular universal, I guess I should say. And so what's going to happen in perception is Hegel is going to talk about, well, okay, now we can talk about properties. Does that get us closer to the truth? If it does, like, what are the problems with talking about properties? Here, you might want to think of like empiricism. Like the real sort of crux of this chapter is about like Locke and Hume. You know, you encounter properties like fire, or sorry, you encounter properties like hot, red, etc. Is fire the substance binding all of those properties together? Is the fire the truth of the properties? Or is it really that I only encounter the properties, I don't encounter the substance? So is that the truth of what's going on? That sort of thing. I guess that's just to give you a sort of snapshot of what the perception chapter is going to look at.
Tyler, just like most bare bones accounts, could we say that with sense certainty, what we have is consciousness is saying what is true is the absolutely concrete, the most fundamental, pure form of concreteness. It runs into realizing that this concreteness is actually mediated through the universal. And for sense certainty, it's kept the pure concrete and the pure universal apart. And then that's the negative moment. This pure concrete runs into this pure universal. And then the next dialectical step is going to be what you, like, as you said, the determinate universal in perception.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Sammy?
Oh, speaking of concrete, I'm going to probably keep doing this throughout the seminar just because, well, like Bert said, I'm dumb. Or in other words, I think a little bit, like it's a lot of these terms and like are abstract in the sense that like when we're using Hegelese, like, it's harder to grasp. But if I just have a few like examples of how this plays out, right? So, and the one that stood out to me first was thinking about language as actually. Okay, I'll just say the example. Think about when you're like 13 years old and you're like, I'm gonna write poetry. I have a feeling. I have this feeling inside of me, and it expressed what I'm gonna try to write a poem. So you write a poem. It's terrible. Why is it terrible? You have very limited like poetic diction. You have very limited like set of words, of ideas that you're actually using because you're a 13-year-old and your emotions still, or your feelings still are very underdeveloped in a sense. You're just beginning to feel certain things. It's usually love poems. And to say that at that point, if someone was like, well, see, language just can't get at that inexpressible feeling. It's like, no, we have like the more and more words, like we have these very specific words. And part of the process of poetry is like feeling out the different words and how well they map onto your feeling. And in the process of trying to do that, you actually change and expand the feeling itself, right? And like by bringing it out of the mist of your sort of teenage angst, it becomes this crystallized thing. And I feel like the distinction here between emotion even and feeling is helpful, where emotion is sort of a performed or more bodily thing, right? That it's more basic, and when we all feel sad or angry, and we show that through our body. But a feeling is the crystallization almost through language and expression of a particular moment. And not a particular moment where you're just like waving at it, being like this thing and I can't express it, but an individual moment, right? Where you use these quasi-universal terms to map, to record that specificity, right? And the reason, and I think this is cool because you can just start to think of all these different fields, and this works with all of them. Think about food. Think about how one learns to cook, right? If you're not given any universal sort of rules and formulas for recipes, like I'm not even talking about just following a recipe like by the letter, right? But knowing like, okay, if I'm gonna make a curry, I need a spice, an oil, a this and a that, specific formula. And then once you master those forms, you get to but you also have to remain connected to the specific sort of sense certainty you have with the ingredients, right? Like this particular spice is, this way, and it melds with this oil in another way. But you can't limit yourself to either of those options, either of those ways of thinking. Otherwise, you're going to end up. I think this is how people end up with stoner food, is because, let's just be honest, weed takes you into and other drugs take you into a more sensuous, immediate experience. And so you're not thinking about the rules or the formulas or like what things go together. You're just like, I like that, I like that, I like that. Put it all together. Yes. And I don't know. I know these are very like.
That's a stoner thing?
That's just how Dave cooks.
That's just how I've always cooked. Oh, sorry, no.
I know those kind of plebeian examples, but those were how I was thinking.
That was really helpful.
Well, can I actually add a little to the poetry example, maybe to like really bring it to like the movement from abstract to less abstract?
I want to share one sentence as a bridge, because what Sammy was saying, like the idea that those feelings become more, you can kind of emphasize more, and they kind of become their own thing as well. That's kind of what I felt, and I don't think this was quite said, that the introduction was building up to. The big moment is to say that the essence of the object of knowledge is changed in trying to get a closer understanding of it, right? And that the essence is, it says on 56 that the essence is something different from what it was at the preceding stage. Does that tie in with the poetry thing?
I think it can.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I'm not going to try though.
Fair.
Basically, all I was going to say is, I mean, if sense certainty is this like here and this and like these very abstract terms that are these sort of universals, I mean, that is kind of definitely, particularly with like the cliche, like this is what a young person's poetry starts, and I can say mine was very much like this, is like, the love poem, and like all you have is like love, right? And like, and love and not love, right? And then you go, well, that doesn't mean anything, right? Like because all you can say is I love so and so, right? Like that's the first sort of poetic impulse, is like I love you, and all love is the same. And you go, oh wait, but no, it's not, because I don't love so and so. The love I have for my mother is not the love I have for this person, right? Now we have romantic love, we have familial love, we have sexual love, which is its own really different, and then it develops, and the language you have to use becomes more specific and more concrete as you develop as a poet, until you get to this place where all of a sudden it seems super abstract to some people. It's because you're being so fucking concrete that like you're writing about very, very specific moments. We were talking about it in the Marquez seminar, that like Marquez realized that the more specific he got to his own life, the more universal it was to other people's experiences, right? Because instead of this like, oh, we just built a city and it sucked and it fell apart because we didn't know what we were doing, he wrote this very specific narrative that we can relate to, even though I've never been to Colombia, I don't speak Spanish, I don't have a family anything like his family, or the family in 100 Years of Solitude, yet the relationship on a human level is so much there.
Or
does that?
Yeah.
go with what you were getting at?
I just was gonna say, to quote a nice Nin, the individual life lived deeply broadens into universals, or the universe. Yeah. Universal truth, or something like that. But it's the same idea, you know.
Yeah.
This is exactly what Hegel means by concrete universality, right? It's not just some abstract formula or something like that, right? It's something universal on the basis of its being concrete, right? And so Marquez would be an example here. People point at Shakespeare, right? Shakespeare is something that is very well universal in a lot of ways, right? But is nonetheless very particular at the same time. And so in a lot of ways, this is what Hegel is trying to get at in the phenomenology science, is give us the sort of tools that we need to think concretely, because thinking concretely is a task. It's not something as easy as pointing to a this, right? That's part of what he's trying to point out. He hopes that by the end of the phenomenology, you're not thinking abstractly, right? Thinking as concretely as you possibly can, using this sort of toolbox that he's given.
So poets can justify reading Hegel. Wonderful. Great.
That's great. So we're at time, and I just wanted to touch on a couple of things, and then if anybody had something that they really are dying to get, you know, they could have the last word. But I wanted to say that, okay, so, you know, thank you Bert for leading off. Thanks Mikey, and thanks Mikey and Tyler for coming with some things prepared as well. Everyone you know, really brought it today. And I was talking to them each over the phone this week, kind of in preparation for next week, right? Tyler will be leading off the conversation, because next week's the part of perception is not any more difficult really than the part on self-certainty. But once you get into force and understanding, those are like, I don't know, 10 pages or so of like what can be pretty difficult. So the whole question was like, oh, so are we still doing this beginner's track thing? If so, how? Would it be different? Would we just, you know, would people who are taking the beginner track do something different, like read companion stuff or whatever? But the general consensus seems to be, and this is something that we can modify and play with, but like the general consensus seems to be, well, the preface you don't have to read first. You can read it after, and it is like a slog, and it's really hard. So it's something that the beginner track can come back to, but that the rest of this, one thing folds into the next thing, and we're all going to be on this together. And so really, if anything, it seems like the beginner track was more about the first 2 weeks, just reading the intro and the part on self-certainty and then rereading it to really get a foothold in the text, not really worrying about the preface until later. But from here on out, it's just, we're just going to kind of plow through. And people feel free to dive in and make any alterations or suggestions. But the one thing I wanted to point out also is some people didn't realize this. I'd forgotten about it. The end of this edition that we all have, the Miller edition, has a section by Finley, who does Bert donated a companion text to this by Finley to our library. And I read some of the beginning of it. He's fantastic. But Finley does this paragraph by paragraph analysis of every paragraph at the back of the book.
The analysis, like summaries.
Summaries
like
of yeah. So now that I know that, it's like if I kind of want to get up and walk away and wash some dishes for a minute, or maybe I'm on a drive or something like that, or maybe I just want to sit and watch something and take notes. Half-hour Hegel's an excellent way to go about it, right? Because you see the paragraphs you're dealing with on the thumbnails in the series on YouTube, so you can go right to where you're stuck, or right where you're at. But also, yeah, you have the option of seeking further clarification right here. And then obviously there's also like the group, Facebook group. So anything else? What do y'all think about that? So,
I don't want to miss any of it.
Emergent tracks is.
I'm just gonna do it.
It's cool, and beware. However long it took you to read this week, you should plan at least an hour and a half to 2 hours longer. Maybe more than that.
Forcing understanding is really hard, but it's probably the hardest chapter in the book. So you just get through it. You know, maybe you don't understand very much of it. Hopefully, maybe a little bit more after the session. But at least for me, the first 2 times I read the Phenomenology, I left forcing understanding, kind of feeling like I still don't really get this. And you kind of just gotta keep going afterwards. Luckily, you enter like a new stage of the Phenomenology or whatever. And so even if it was like really hard or confusing, at least the next thing isn't as intimately tied together, at least as some of the sections do.
Did you just say the first few times you read the Phenomenology? How many times have you read it?
I think 3 times. I've read sections more, but I think I've gone beginning to end 3 times.
Wow.
First time was a total loss, and then the other times, you know, it got more out. That was my experience. I don't know. I think you guys are getting a lot more out of your first reading than I did. Based on that.
Weekly.
That's what friends are for. That's why you had to pave the way for us all. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.
This is a moment where I go back to one of my favorite Jay-Z lines. Hove did that, so hopefully you won't have to go through that.
All right.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
See you next week.
Everybody.